Hi, everybody. Welcome back. 12:22. Oh, come on, really? Okay. And I want to talk today about the coming of the war. Just a little bit of background. It's easy to sort of see the North versus the South as a kind of simple story, a simple divide between the slaveholding regions and the non-slaveholding regions. And of course, those regions have been divided for quite a while at 3630. But there were plenty of, in terms of voters and in terms of people who might fight, there were plenty of divides inside the Union and inside the Confederacy, what would become the Union and the Confederacy. I want to talk a little bit about that today. There's a region in the north called the Butternut region, which is the kind of southern part of Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio, and you can see those as the blue regions there. And as you can see, those are places that voted for Stephen Douglas, the Democratic candidate. And those are places that did not, many of them did not want to fight a war. They were called butternuts because they tended to be poor people who had left the South to go to southern Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. And they had kind of homemade clothing that they dyed with butternut trees, and so they had this kind of outfit that was butternut. They also tended to, during the war, carry copper pennies in their lapels. Right, in the lapel here, there's always a kind of little slot in there, and people put a copper penny inside the lapel with the word liberty sticking out at the top, which is a very discreet reference to their opposing being drafted to fight a war for the Union. And they were called, and then of course Copperhead is a snake, and so many Union people called these anti-war, anti-Civil War folks Copperheads because they were arguing that they were snakes. Now, it is true that these people did disrupt Union organization. They sometimes they created secret organizations that tried to stop recruiting of Union soldiers and things like that. But before, so there's a butternut region in the north, and there's a kind of anti-Confederate region in the south, primarily in the hills and the mountains, places where kind of no one in the community had any slaves, or very, very few people. Those people did not see a reason to support slavery. And so East Tennessee and Western Virginia, Western North Carolina tended to be pretty strongly anti-slaveholder as well. And you can see that in this image. This is the votes for the 1860 election in that region where, let's see, where you have Bell, in the support for Bell, which is kind of eastern Tennessee, western North Carolina, and up in the mountains there. The Bell support, Bell was a constitutional Union Whig, and also did not support a war over slavery. Okay, so how do we get from an election to a war, though? To do that, we've got a timeline. Remember that there's a 3 or 4 month lag between the time that Lincoln is elected and he's inaugurated. And so he's elected, he's declared elected in November 6th of 1860. In January of 1861, so by that point, only one state secedes immediately after Lincoln's election, and that's South Carolina. And South Carolina claims that it is no longer part of the Union, and it tries to persuade the other southern states to join it. There is a lot of kind of secessionist activity, kind of guerrilla activity. There are, remember, those armories that the one that's Denmark Vesey tried to raid in South Carolina. Every state, particularly in the capital, has an armory. Athens, for example, had an armory near the university. And many people who kind of support secession raid those armories for weapons. They're Union armories, but they're taken by Confederates, white Southerners. But only South Carolina formally secedes in 1860. And Confederate forces in South Carolina fire on the Star of the West, which is a ship that's trying to resupply Fort Sumter in the South Carolina, the Charleston Harbor. Buchanan basically ignores this. And I think you've heard of the term team of rivals to describe Lincoln's cabinet. My colleague Steve Barry says that Buchanan has a team of scoundrels, that many of the people in the Democrat Buchanan's cabinet were actively trying to destabilize the Union in the midst of, as this war starts to begin. Secretary of War, for example, stealing munitions, Secretary of State allowing the banks to be raided by Confederate raiders and things like that. Lincoln is inaugurated formally in March of '61. The Confederates again fire, this time not on a ship, but on Fort Sumter in April of 1861. And by that point, Georgia, as you see, and Alabama and Mississippi, basically the deep South states, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida have all seceded at this point, and they're seceding before Lincoln is inaugurated. But it's still the deep South at this point. When the Confederates fire on Fort Sumter, though, shortly after, 2 days after, Lincoln calls for 75,000 state militia across the country to put down this rebellion. And it's at this point that what's called the Second Secession begins, or what some people call the Second Secession begins, and that's where the upper South states then secede. As North Carolina and Tennessee and Arkansas, Virginia say that they will not allow soldiers to be recruited to put down this rebellion. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's how it happens. We can get a little bit of a sense of why those numbers are the way they are. If we look at the percentage of slave population in the Deep South, percentage of population in the Deep South is 47% slave in what's called the core Confederacy, those Deep South states of Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. The ones that secede after the firing on Fort Sumter, Virginia, Tennessee, Tennessee, and North Carolina have a smaller slave population, 29%. And then there are a few states that stay in the Union even though they have slavery, and that's Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri. Although there is a lot of, there are many slaveholders who try to, the Confederacy does try to organize opposition to the state inside the state. And so there's conflict inside those states as well. Lincoln says, I would like to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. Right? Because if you look at Kentucky, it's on the Ohio River, it's a southern part of the Ohio River. If the Union has to fight across the Ohio River, that's really impossible, or nearly impossible. Right? Getting troops back and forth across a river is not a simple task. Having Union forces in Kentucky is crucial to be able to move into the South. Does that make sense? Okay, and so this is part of the reason that Lincoln does not want to abolish slavery, right? Because he wants Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri on his side. He wants those southern states on his side, and he fears that if he talks about abolition of slavery in the South, that those states will switch sides and join the Confederacy. And as Lincoln sees it, that's basically suicide for the Union. And so initially, this is a kind of complicated war because the Union is in a position where it cannot attack slavery directly, according to Lincoln's orders. General Fremont, for example, in the West, he had been the presidential candidate in 1856 for the Republican Party. General Fremont frees enslaved people in the West, I think it's in Missouri, and Lincoln immediately removes him from command, right? So he says, this is not a war about slavery, this is a war about secession. This is a war about putting down a rebellion. Okay, so some of those internal divisions again. The pro-Confederates I talked about, the Copperheads or the Butternuts in the North. There were organizations that tried to stop Union recruitment, that attacked Union war drives, that held anti-war rallies. In the South, we have pro-Union folks who are called mountaineers sometimes. Those are the people who are in Western Virginia and East Tennessee and Western North Carolina. You see the thing that looks like rain there, you know, that band between East Tennessee and Unionist North Carolina. And then also Germans who are in, where are they? They're the dots, in Missouri and Texas. So there are a lot of German-speaking folks. They have German newspapers in places like Missouri and also Texas. And so these people are also, they're not slaveholders by and large, and they have no interest in defending the Confederacy. And so they're kind of more or less pulled into the Confederacy to a certain extent because they're in that land, but they're in opposition to it. And so there's opposition to Confederate drives to round up soldiers as well, particularly in the mountains of North Carolina and in these German regions. Okay, we look at the Union Confederacy in kind of raw numbers. There's some really important differences. The North is not industrial. The North is primarily agricultural, but much of the industry that does exist in the South is in the North, in those cities, primarily along the coast. Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Baltimore, which is in Maryland, which is in the Union. So if we look at total population, we see a much larger Union. That's in part because of a large number of settlers that have moved into the West, from Europe into the West, but also large population growth. In terms of factory production, it's, you know, the Union outnumbers the Confederacy 10-1. Railroad mileage, it's also 7-3. Iron production is hugely different. But even farm acreage, there's much more farm acreage in the North and in the South, much more wheat in the North, and almost no cotton, of course. Wealth overall is 3-1. And if we look at Union, though, at military service, it looks a little bit different. We see the number of free men in military service is smaller. And why is it 44-56? I'm forgetting now. 90 and 10. It's a smaller number than in the Confederacy, and that's in part because the Confederacy starts the draft early. Every man over the age of 21, and then every man over the age of 16 and under 50 is drafted into the Confederate Army. This draft is not introduced in quite the same way in the Union. In the Union, you can buy your way out of the draft by paying a fee. White population is 20 million in the North, 6 million in the South, but many more men are drafted in the South than in the North. Okay. paying for a war is important. We can't really understand war after, say, after the fiscal revolution, financial revolution of the 1680s. We can't really understand war without debt. Debt is crucial for making war possible. The munitions and the arms and the pay for soldiers, all that other sort of stuff. There's no budget that can possibly accommodate the number of people that fight in these popular wars from the 1680s forward. And so it's really how well organized your loan system is that's crucial to understanding who's going to win. And here the Union does have a great opportunity. It's able to sell war bonds early. Jay Cooke is the kind of mastermind of the popular sales of Union war bonds, getting people to buy them. He's persuaded that these war bonds will be sold in Europe, and they do sell very well in Europe. People are willing to buy Union war bonds, in part because they believe that a war is over, while they recognize that the war is over the extension of slavery, they understand that the South and the North are divided over the question of slavery, and people are willing to buy these bonds. They actually pay fairly well. And the 730 loan is one of the most important of these. My battery's almost dead, low power mode. And he also argues that regular American merchants in the United States will buy these as well. And this turns out to be also true and surprising, that previous issuing of treasury bonds, there are relatively few Americans that held treasury bonds going all the way back. But Cooke argues that kind of popular campaigns, whistle-stop tours and things like that, you can persuade people who bought, say, bought their way out of Union service, persuade them also to buy bonds or be kind of branded as traitors. And there is a really popular support for the Union that Cooke kind of is able to drum up. And this is important. The Confederacy is in a much more difficult position in terms of issuing bonds, because the Confederacy, if you remember that in 1841 to 43, a bunch of southern states didn't pay their debts back. By the 1850s, Michigan and Illinois, the ones that didn't pay their debts back, did pay their debts back. Mississippi, though, still hasn't paid its debt back for its old bonds. Arkansas, Florida. And so Jefferson Davis turns out to be one of the worst people to be the president of the Confederacy, because he's in Mississippi and the Union is able to find a speech in which Jefferson Davis says Mississippi should never pay back its bonds. If Mississippi's not going to pay back its bonds, why should you trust the Confederacy to pay back its bonds, right? Does that make sense? The Confederacy is issuing these bonds, but the president of the Confederacy is someone who's already endorsed not paying Mississippi's bonds that were issued in 1841 to 43. So Union propagandists say he's not just the commander-in-chief of the Confederacy, he's the repudiator-in-chief of the Confederacy, and he will not pay those bonds back. So this is one of the things that's key for understanding why the Confederacy can't raise that much money. The Union quickly, though, does run out of cash to pay for this war. It doesn't have a strong banking system. Remember, it's vetoed the Second Bank of the United States. There are the pet banks, but some of those are in the South. The Treasury is not in great shape, and so relatively quickly, the Union has to issue new currency. A National Banking Act basically creates a series of national banks that are supported by the Union. And those banks will hold gold and silver just like every other bank, but they'll also hold US bonds. And this creates an instant market for those US bonds. It helps that every bank in the Union has basically stopped paying its debts by 1862, so all of the banks are kind of seized up. Nobody has enough gold and silver. And so a series of Union banks are created, and they create this new currency called the greenback. It's not backed by gold, it's not backed by silver, but it's backed as colored green, and so people call it a greenback. It's kind of a joke name for it, because it's what's called fiat currency. It's basically issued by the Union, but there's no gold behind it. Okay, so that's another thing those banks are allowed to do, is issue this currency, and the expectation is that this currency will return to the gold standard at some point in the future once the secession is over. Okay, does that make sense? Okay. It's the Union is capable of quickly creating a kind of infrastructure for fighting once this war starts. You have a large number of women who end up working in munitions factories in places like Watertown, Massachusetts, and elsewhere. Colt Armory and a bunch of other manufacturers of ships and manufacturers of weapons and other war material are capable of drawing on large numbers of unemployed workers in cities, and women in large numbers, white women in large numbers, come in to work in these factories as well. This is a kind of a grim image because it shows women in Watertown, Massachusetts, munitions workers, but this munitions factory that they were in it blew up and actually killed almost everybody who was in the factory at the time. In part, it was just a poor control of gunpowder. A crucial thing, if we want to understand war, is logistics, how it is that soldiers and armor and material move from place to place. And here the Union has a serious advantage. The Union is invading the South, right, to put down the rebellion. It's attacking Confederate soldiers in the South, so it doesn't have direct control over the South. But kind of around the South is a railway network that is much larger and much denser. Now, that said, a bunch of these railroads aren't joined together in an interstate way until like 1862 or 1863. So it is actually quite kind of nearly impossible to move soldiers from, say, Washington to Louisville over by rail. It's not until about 1864 that there's continuous traffic. Railroads have different gauges, they have different engines, they have different people who are in control of them. You can't just move a train continuously from one end to the other. But over time, the Union War Department allows the kind of funding of this and the support for the connection of these lines, the consolidation of these lines, so that it makes it easier for a move from east to west. The larger strategy on the part of the Union, under Winfield Scott, is what's called the Anaconda Plan, where he will surround the Confederacy, blockade cotton from leaving the South, and blockade war material from coming into the South. You notice material is spelled differently here. It's a French word. War materiel is basically anything besides soldiers, anything that's needed to fight in a war. And so medicines are allowed to come into the South, food and cloth, but anything that's used by an army will be blockaded by Union ships. And Union ships successfully blockade most of the major southern ports, including New Orleans, Norfolk, Hampton Roads, where else? Charleston, and places like that. This blockade, many, many more ships in New England at this time, and many more steamships, and they're capable of blockading these harbors. That's the plan. And why it's important is because when the Confederacy tries to issue bonds to sort of pay for this war, it promises to pay them back with cotton. But if the Union can block cotton from being exported to Europe, then the bonds can't be paid. So there's a big loan that the Confederacy tries to start, the Erlanger loan in 1862, to pay for the Confederacy. But basically can't. It's supposed to pay off. The bond is supposed to be paid off in cotton, but it doesn't successfully work. That said, there are ships. Confederates fill up warships and what we'll call blockade runners that try to run through these blockades, sneak across those boundaries. And those work to a certain extent, but they also take a lot of investment. And many planters who want to make a quick buck invest in blockade runners. And the Confederacy, on the other hand, is, by comparison, not as strong. The Union is able to kind of get wealthy people to kind of support the war in funding the Union. The Confederacy is less successful at getting planters, large slaveholders, to support the war in a kind of financial way. War material and slavery. When the Union takes Fortress Monroe in eastern Virginia, General Benjamin Butler is put in charge of troops. He's a general there in charge. And as you can see here, enslaved men who are drafted by the Confederate government to build earthworks cross the border into Union territory. And now I said that there was a draft in the Confederacy. The first draft in the Confederacy was a draft of slaves. So 1 in 10 enslaved people initially, and then 1 in 20, and then more are taken away from slaveholders and put to work in the Confederate Army. They're not issued guns or anything. That would be unacceptable to the Confederacy. But they are drafted to build earthworks and other things to support the Confederacy, to build munitions buildings. They're drafted in Atlanta to build those sorts of things, clothing works and militia. And so they are effectively, as they see it, being used in a war. And so Benjamin Butler is not allowed to end slavery in this region, but he comes up with this clever legal idea that these black men are owned by slaveholders, but they're being used as war material, right? And are therefore contraband. Contraband means not allowed. So war material is blocked. And so he says that they are people, just like guns, that can't, while they are people, they're just like guns, and they can't support the Union war effort. He's allowed to block them from going back across Confederate lines. So he calls them contraband of war, and contraband becomes a term to describe enslaved people who escape into the Union Army or on the Union side of these battles. As a result, self-emancipating men and women escape into Union lines in what are called contraband camps. There are big ones in D.C., in Hampton Roads, in outside of New Orleans. And these contraband camps are basically slaves who've liberated themselves by staying in Union lines. The claim, the expectation is that the Union will return these people, but increasingly Union soldiers prevent that from happening. Right? They threaten anyone who tries to cross into Union territory and return with enslaved people. This is not official policy, but unofficially, it's basically impossible to bring people back, or very, very difficult to bring people back across those lines. Does that make sense? Okay. I'm trying to watch the chat, but my battery's almost dead. So these are the lines that they cross, the pickets that are established outside. Those wooden things are called abattis, and the abattis are the things that you have to cross between one line and another. I want to very quickly run through the first attempt to capture the Confederate capital of Richmond by the Union Army. And this is important because if the war had ended in 1862, it's quite possible that slavery would have continued to exist in the South after the war. But it fails badly. The Union fails badly. And it takes another couple of years for the Union to win this war. And I think understanding why it fails to capture Richmond, even though it's massively outnumbers in terms of people and material, the Confederacy, it still loses. Okay, initially McClellan, the plan is to land here on Yorktown, as you can see. Initially through Fortress Monroe. That's where it's on the tip of Eastern Virginia. And then once they've established themselves, they march up and capture Yorktown, and Yorktown becomes another landing place. And then over 100,000 Union soldiers march towards Richmond, and they are stopped by Confederate earthworks that have been built by enslaved people right there along the Warwick River. And it's here that McClellan, who is the general, doesn't quite know what to do, doesn't quite know how many soldiers he has on the other side, and so hires the first stupid tech bro, I would argue, in American history to solve this problem for him. And this becomes Thaddeus Lowe. Thaddeus Lowe is called the first person, a person in the Air Force, the Union Air Force, and he has balloons, basically. And he sends the balloons up, and they inspect Confederate territory to identify how many soldiers there are. Now, initially, when Confederates see these balloons, they shoot at them, but then the sort of Confederates get together and decide, no, we'll just let these people go up, but they just set up way more encampments than there are soldiers. And so they march from camp to camp, going back and forth between these little tents. And so there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tents on the other side of these earthworks that the Confederates are pretending to be in, and they're just moving from tent to tent. And so when Lowe looks up, he measures, he counts, and while the Union has 100,000 soldiers, Lowe is pretty sure there's over 100,000 Confederate soldiers. In fact, there's something like 60,000. In fact, the Union outnumbers the Confederacy about 2 to 1. And in fact, it would be very easy to pass over these earthworks. So basically what the Union does is, rather than just try to pass through the earthworks, they establish siege machinery. They bring siege weapons, they bring artillery, they bring cannon, they bring all this other stuff. They bring portable ovens, they set down for a long siege, everything's set up, they start to advance, and just as they're advancing, they discover that there are no Confederates. They've all left. And there's nothing to attack, basically. This takes over a month and drastically slows down the Union war effort. The Confederacy, meanwhile, is rapidly drafting people, pulling them along out of North Carolina, Georgia, and South Carolina, lining them all up in front of Richmond, trying to stop the Union Army, which greatly outnumbers them. And as I say here, so after he passes Williamsburg, he moves up the Chickahominy River, so you can see Williamsburg down there at the bottom, right outside of Richmond, and he's got 105,000 soldiers there. Joseph Johnston has only 60,000. And there's a smaller corps of McDowell's soldiers further north there, as you can see. But McClellan has 105,000 soldiers. Now, there are telegraphs that are strung all the way through here. Lincoln is sort of ordering McClellan to do things. McClellan is basically ignoring Lincoln's messages. But a crucial thing to understand is that the Confederacy has flooded most of the rivers. They've broken most of the dams along the Chickahominy rivers and elsewhere and turned them into a flood zone, which is excellent. Very much like what we're seeing now in Ukraine. There's lots of flooded land, which makes artillery and other things like that move very, very slowly. And this is they're basically breaking all the dams up and down the Chickahominy River, turns it into a floodplain, which makes it very difficult. And the Union depends on soldiers to do the bridge building. But as you can imagine, soldiers are not especially expert bridge builders as a whole, and they're just basically pulled in to do this work. And this is the Grapevine Bridge. that's built across the Chickahominy River by Union soldiers, and it takes them almost a month as they're kind of setting up for battle to do this. And this is another view of the Grapevine Bridge. And artillery can't easily move across this, right? The trouble is that the Union forces are split on one side and the other side of the Chickahominy River. And this is a serious problem because you can't move soldiers from one place to another. You've got a line of battle, but people on the east can't go to the west and people on the west can't go to the east. Does that make sense? So this is an image of the battle that becomes Seven Pines, one of the highest casualty rates of any battle in the Civil War. And as you can see, there's the Grapevine Bridge up there, and you've got Sumner, Richardson, and Franklin on one side of the Grapevine Bridge, Sedgwick, Keyes, and Kearny on the other. And basically what the Confederacy is capable of doing is because it doesn't have a bridge to cross, it moves most of its soldiers to the right and tries to attack this smaller force, Sedgwick, Keyes, Kearny, and Hooker on the other side. And the Union cannot support them. And so it's basically, the battle ends up in a draw, but with lots of casualties on both sides. More casualties actually by the Confederacy than by the Union, but the Union doesn't get anywhere. And that's the Battle of Seven Pines or Fair Oaks. And it's at this battle that Robert E. Lee takes over command of the Army of Northern Virginia because the other general is wounded and then dies in this fight. Okay, then at this point, Jeb Stuart runs a reconnaissance raid around the troops, the Union troops, and he sees, as you can see here, very, very quickly riding all the way around the Union Army, which is a massive host. He determines, if you see up there at the top, that Stoneman's Corps, which is supposed to be there, some of their material is there, but there are no soldiers there. And so he sees this big hole in the Union Army line around Richmond. That corps has been held back by Lincoln because he fears that Washington, D.C. is going to be invaded by Confederate troops. But this is very difficult for McClellan. McClellan is very angry about not having Stoneman's men here. But the Confederacy takes advantage of this gap, advances, and forces the Union to retreat in June 29th of 1862. And Confederates basically are outnumbered by Union forces, but because of the Grapevine Bridge, because of the these difficulties of kind of intelligence and things like that, they're able to force the Union Army to retreat at that bridge. And let's see, where are we? At that's not New Cold Harbor. Yeah, and it's Jackson's corps that gets behind and takes Grapevine Bridge, forcing, basically, preventing Union resupply from the north. This is a serious problem for the Union because it has no supply lines now, once the Confederacy has basically gotten behind them. Does that make sense? And once the Confederacy has gotten behind them, then the Union has to retreat, and basically the invasion of Richmond is over. And the war is going to take another 3 years. Almost 3 years. Okay, so traditionally the story is told as the kind of heroism of Robert E. Lee and the kind of embarrassingly bad generalship of General McClellan, but I would suggest that there's more complex problems in here. One of them is the sort of massive supply line that the Union requires to invade. They're very dependent on artillery, but artillery require lots and lots of people, lots and lots of horses, lots and lots of food. Robert E. Lee does come to the fore in this period, but I don't think he's out-generaled. I think McClellan is basically out, it's logistic problems. But it's certainly true that McClellan has terrible, terrible intelligence. And another part of it, the problem is low, and part of the problem is his Secret Service Bureau, as they're called. It's a little confusing because there's a Secret Service that defends the president that emerges in this time, and there's also McClellan's Secret Service. McClellan's Secret Service are these spies that he sends across Confederate lines to get them to what's the word? To get information. The trouble is, it's pretty clear that the Secret Service does a terrible job of collecting intelligence. They're not Southerners, and so they don't have Southern accents, and so they're instantly kind of picked out. Now, spies can, of course, be hanged instantly if they're discovered. But rather than hang them, basically what the Confederates do is feed them all sorts of information, including inflated stories about how large the Confederate force is. So part of the reason that McClellan constantly believes that he's outnumbered is Thaddeus Lowe, and part of it is the Secret Service Bureau. After McClellan steps down, about a year after this failed conflict, the Secret Service Bureau is instantly cashiered. These are the people who are cashiered. Means that they basically lose their positions. They no longer work. It's such a terrible intelligence organization. This is most associated with McClellan and what is his name? I've now forgotten Pinkerton. Alan Pinkerton is at the head of this organization, and of course Pinkerton's detective agency is basically an anti-union organization in the 1870s and 80s. But Pinkerton makes up all these stories about how fantastic his intelligence is, even though he and all of his soldiers are removed from service. So in the next class, I want to talk to you about actually how Grant wins the conflict, but it's not just weak McClellan and strong Grant. There's fundamental transformation of the Union Army that takes place by 1862 and 1863 that's going to make the Union victory possible. Okay. Excellent. What I'd like to do now is a quiz. Bear with me. And this will be familiar content. Okay. This is quiz, technically quiz 4. Can people see that on their screens? They go to ELC.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. See you guys next week.